My name is Thomas Heinis, and today I will talk about querying and analyzing big scientific data. Because what is happening in the sciences today is a drastic paradigm shift towards data-driven scientific discovery. That essentially means that scientists no longer only develop a hypothesis and then make single observations to corroborate this hypothesis. What they do instead is they collect massive amounts of data. They scan, for example, the entire sky at night, and then analyze this data in order to find interesting phenomenon, to develop a hypothesis, and then use the same data to corroborate this hypothesis. And this isn't only happening in astronomy, this is happening across different disciplines. We are seeing this in fluid dynamics, where instead of solving problems solely analytically, what we do instead is we simulate them on massive compute infrastructures. And as I said, this is happening everywhere and leads to massive amounts of data. For example, in the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, we're seeing 12 petabytes of data per experiment. In the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, we are seeing 4 petabytes of data per year. And in the successor of the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, we're going to see 4 petabytes of data per day. And in the Human Brain Project, we are seeing about 100 gigabytes of data being produced by simulations every second. And this is all data that needs to be analyzed. And scientists today are overwhelmed with these amounts of big data. And it's not just that the data is big, it's also growing quite fast. We try to show this with a graph where we have on the x-axis time, and on the y-axis we're showing the cumulative size of data sets in a particular disciplines. So in astronomy, data is growing very fast because we have better telescopes with high resolution. In physics, we have better sensors that collect and record more data. So also there, the amount of data is growing very fast. In the simulation sciences, we have bigger supercomputers, more powerful supercomputers, and that leads to more data being produced. And then finally, also in gene sequencing, we have more instruments with better resolution that lead to massively more data. So the scientific data grows super linear, and clearly we need the means to analyze this data, this growing data, efficiently. Now, to make an example from the simulation sciences, there the growth of the data happens along 3 different dimensions. We have the coverage, the duration, and the resolution. By coverage, we essentially mean that the data grows because the models grow in size. We simulate bigger phenomenon, bigger models there. The resolution dimension basically means that we increase the level of detail that we simulate. So we went from very, very coarse-grained spatial models to very, very fine-grained mesh models. And then finally, we increase the simulation duration, and that means that also more data is being produced. We went from hours, and now we're simulating days of activity, and so on. And these 3 dimensions are not independent of each other. They're actually multiplicative, meaning that if we increase the coverage and increase the duration as well, the data, the amount of data being produced, grows superlinear or even exponential. And that, of course, means that we need to have the means to analyze this data efficiently. Now, let's have a look at the simulation science data challenges. What you see here is a very simple workflow that is used in the simulation sciences. We start with the observational data, we build spatial models with it, then we go into the simulation, and then finally we arrive at the simulation output, at the post-simulation data. Now, in each of these steps, we need to have the tools to deal with this data, with these massive amounts of data. So for the spatial modeling, we need the tools or the algorithms to do static 3D exploration, to do interactive 3D exploration, and also to do spatial analysis. And in the simulation part of the workflow, we need the tools and the algorithms to do dynamic 3D exploration. And for all these parts, for all these aspects of dealing with simulation data, we need to have scalable spatial access methods. And that's what I will talk about in the rest of this lecture. Now, I will talk about what we have done, in particular in the context of the Human Brain Project for all of these aspects. For reasons of time, I will focus on only 3 of them. I will talk about static 3D exploration, interactive 3D exploration, as well as dynamic 3D exploration. All right, so let me start with static exploration. When the neuroscientists in the Human Brain Project build models of the brain, what they do is they take single neuron models, spatial representations built with thousands of cylinders. You can see an example on the left-hand side. They take several thousands or even millions of these models and put them together in one model that represents a part of the brain. Now, once they've done this, once they've built this model, what they need to do is to analyze this model and make sure that it actually accurately represents the biological phenomenon, right? That is actually represents actual brain tissue. And to do so, what they do is they execute on the model thousands of 3D spatial range queries. Now, because they execute so many of these range queries, this operation needs to be fast, right? And so they need to have an efficient spatial index to execute these range queries quickly. Now, this is not necessarily a new problem. This has been done in the past already. In database management, we've come up with several spatial indexes for exactly this problem. There's one particular instance, one particular method, which is called the R tree, which is essentially a hierarchy of minimum bounding rectangles. The way this works is, if you look at the left-hand side, you see a couple of sample objects. Now, what the R tree does is it builds a hierarchy of bounding boxes. So it takes each of these cylinders on the left-hand side, wraps each one of them into a minimal bounding rectangle, and builds at the same time a hierarchy, as you can see on the right-hand side, right? So once it has wrapped all the objects, it wraps a couple of these objects into minimal bounding rectangles, shown here with red. And then on the right-hand side builds this hierarchy, right? Then it wraps several of the red rectangles into green rectangles, and then finally wraps everything into a black rectangle, right? That's how the R tree works. There have been many, many variants of the R tree. We just list here 3, but there have been several other variants of it, but basically all of them work the same way. They build this recursive hierarchy of minimal bounding rectangles. Now, when we want to execute a range query, we can illustrate this on this hierarchy. What we do is we basically see if the range query intersects with the top level minimum bounding rectangle. If it does, then we look at its children, its descendants, right? We go down, we travel down the tree, this hierarchy, and always check whether or not the range query intersects with the minimal bounding rectangles, and if it does, we look at the descendants of this node until we actually arrive at the bottom level, and that's where we retrieve the actual objects that we've stored in the blue rectangles. Now, as you have been able to see, in this case here, we had to traverse 2 paths to the bottom. That's because we have structural overlap. You can see this on the left-hand side. For example, with the red rectangles, some of them overlap, and that means there are several ambiguous paths through the tree, through the hierarchy, and we need to traverse all of them. Now, in this example, it was just 2. In reality, it's going to be thousands or hundreds of thousands, if not millions of different paths, and that makes execution of these range queries slow. And so the structural overlap, and you can see this with the green rectangles, with the red rectangles, even with blue rectangles, they all overlap, and structural overlap of them degrades performance. And the performance degradation is actually quite bad. We measure this in an initial experiment. We measure, essentially, we execute 500 queries on a data set. So we measure the time on the y-axis, how long it takes to execute 500 queries. and on the x-axis we increase the size of the data set, and we also increase the size of or the density of the data set. And as you can see, we tested this with 3 different variants of the R-tree, the best ones that we could find, the most efficient ones we could find. And as you can see, they grow quite rapidly. So execution time grows quite rapidly. And that should be the case. We're using an index, and that means lookup time should be decoupled of the size of the data set. So the index should be able to point us directly at the bits of the data we need and should retrieve that independent of the size of the data set. But in this case here, the state of the art does not scale with the density and the size of the data set. Now what we have done, we have developed a new index, which we call flat. It's a 2-phased spatial index. And we use the key idea that we're going to use 2 phases, each of which is independent of overlap. So given a range query, shown here with the black rectangle, we have a first phase, the seeding phase, where we find any one object within this range query. And then we have a crawling phase where we traverse the neighborhood and retrieve recursively everything else within the range query. Right, so this is illustrated like this, right? So essentially we use the connectivity to avoid the overlap problem the R-tree has. Now there's a tiny bit of a problem. This actually requires reachability, right? We need to be able to go from one piece, from one cylinder, from one object to the next. And in the case of the neurons, we have this inherent connectivity, but we simply cannot always assume it to be there. So we need to be a bit better than that. We need to do something a bit smarter than that. And so what we do is we introduce this type of what we call reachability information. So during the index building phase, we basically take the entire data set, we partition it, we group spatially close elements together, and then we introduce this kind of reachability information. We introduce this linking, we connect all the neighboring partitions together, and then when we want to execute the range query, we can easily go from one of these partitions to the next. So we add the connectivity, and with that we enable the recursive crawling. Now if we put all these pieces together, let's have a quick look at how flat queries without any overlap. So as I said before, we have this seeding phase where we want to find any one object, and it's a bit counterintuitive, but what we do here is we use an R-tree itself. The idea being that if you want to find any one object, that's a fairly cheap operation even on an R-tree, even with overlap, because we can just traverse one path down the tree to the bottom level. If you want to find everything in a particular range query, then that's a costly operation, but we just want to find one object. So we just go with the range query, we traverse down the tree to the bottom level, right? Again, that's an overlap-free operation. We find the partition that contains an object that we're looking for, and then we do the second phase, the crawling, where we recursively crawl the entire neighborhood of the initial object that we found. And both phases, as I mentioned, seeding and crawling, both avoid the overlap problem and thus should be efficient. Should be, but we'll see in a second that indeed they are. So with this method, we have compared it against the state of the art, against the other approaches, the R-tree approaches, the R-tree variants. So we've done a performance evaluation. We've done the same experiment that I used initially to motivate the work, and we measured on the y-axis the execution time, and again on the x-axis increasing dataset size as well as increasing dataset density. And the picture is as the same as before for the other approaches. They grow quite rapidly with increasing dataset size and density. And for flat, it looks substantially better. Flat, essentially, the line stays flat at the bottom, and that shows that we are able to decouple execution time, query execution time, from the dataset size. And compared to the fastest, to the PR-tree, one of the R-tree variants, flat is 7.8 times faster for what we've tested, for the biggest dataset that we have tested. And so, as I said before, the more important point here is that flat decouples execution time from density. Now, if we look at scalability, that's probably even more important. We do the same experiment here, but we try to take into account the result set cardinality. So what we measure is not the overall time to execute the query, but we measure the time per result object. In this case, it's going to be the cylinders that make up the neurons, right? Now we do this for the same approaches, and we see for the Hilbert R-tree, STR-R-tree, PR-R-tree, for all of them, the time per object, per result object grows. And indeed, for flat, it shrinks. So we start up higher, and then the time to per result object shrinks as the data sets grow, and also as the data set cardinality or the result set cardinality grows. And the reason for that is that we have this kind of seeding cost, the lookup in the R-tree, and the bigger result set size, the more we can trade off or the more we can amortize this cost over the result set. And so the trend for flat is indeed flat, and it scales very well with density. If we increase it, we're not going to expect that it shrinks further, but it's at least not going to grow for bigger data sets. Okay, so that's one approach that we have developed for the static 3D exploration. Now let's have a look at the next problem, at the interactive 3D exploration. What I said before is that essentially a lot of range queries need to be executed, and that's certainly true. But also what happens a lot is that we need to analyze spatial data, or we need to execute sequences of range queries. So for example, on this neural network here, we're not just going to execute one query, we're going to execute an entire sequence along a particular path in the neural network. So we have these spatial range query sequences. They're never random or never entirely random. They typically are following a guiding path, some structure of interest to the user, to the scientist, right? This is not just the case for neural networks, this is also the case for the arterial tree of the heart, for example, or also for the bronchial tree of the lung. Also there we have this kind of structures that users or scientists follow and execute queries along the way. So this type of guided analysis is ubiquitous in scientific applications. Now, of course, here also it's crucial to execute this operation fast, or as fast as possible. But the way it works essentially is that it's interactive. So we don't know a priori the path the user or the scientist will follow. The path is interactive. So basically the user will execute the query, will process the result, look at the result, and then decide where to execute the next query. So we cannot just, like I said, we cannot just execute everything in one go. We don't know where the user or the scientist is going to go. So the way this looks on disk and CPU is essentially that the user decides where to execute the first query. The disk is going to be busy. Then the result is going to be in. The result is going to be processed, shown to the user, and the user decides where to execute the next query. That then is going to be executed as a second query. The disk is again busy, retrieves the result, gets back to the CPU, processes the result, and then decides where to execute the next query, and so on. So that means that CPU and disk at certain points in time are not used. They're basically idle. And with that, we do have an interesting opportunity to speed up the whole operation by using basically when the disk is idle as a prefetching opportunity, so that we retrieve data, as much data as we can, in between the queries. Now, of course, with that, what we can do is we basically execute the first query, then we predict, once we have parts of this first query, predict where the next might be. We start prefetching as well as processing the result. We can do this in parallel, keep both CPU and disk busy. And once the user has decided where to go, we're going to execute that query. We're going to try to reuse as much as possible from whatever we have already retrieved into the cache from the prefetching, right? So we don't have to retrieve as much data again, hopefully, from the disk as for the first query. And this then continues, and we predict, and we prefetch, and we process the results, and so on. But with this, we can effectively speed up the entire sequence of retrieving and processing the query results, right? And with this predictive prefetching, we can essentially hide the data retrieval cost. We basically, as you can see on the disk line, we kind of shrink the retrieval of the query results. That is visible to the user, of course. We have to retrieve the entire result, but we hide this when the results are being processed. Now, this whole area, or this whole problem of predictive prefetching, is not entirely new. Also here, already approaches have been developed. There is, for example, the exponential weighted moving average, straight line approach, as well as the Hilbert prefetching. And we've tested all of them, and we tested basically how they behave with increasing volumes of query, as you can see on the x-axis, as well as we have measured the cache hit rate on the y-axis. Basically, the cache hit rate tells us how much of the prefetch result can we actually use, right? And ideally, this is as high as possible, because that then means we don't have to go and fetch any other result. We've done this on the neuroscience sets with 25 queries in a sequence, and the results are fairly good for very, very small queries. But as the query size increases, the cache hit rate of these known approaches shrinks quite drastically. So it goes below 10%. That basically means that only 10% of the prefetch data we can actually reuse for the next query, which is simply not good enough, right? And the reason for that is that they are essentially oblivious to the structure being followed. They just try to extrapolate whatever the positions of the past few queries. And that works quite well for small queries. There you can easily predict the next query position in the sequence. But it works remarkably bad for large volume queries, because the guiding structure, the path being followed, can twist and bend and turn in big queries, which it can't in small queries. So it twists and bends in large queries, and so you can completely mispredict with a straight line approach, for example. You can completely mispredict where the next query will be. So the state of the art is not very efficient with arbitrary query volume. So what we have done is we have developed Scout, a new approach, content-aware prefetching we call it, and the key insight is that we look at the content of the previous queries. We inspect the query result, we identify the guiding path, and then we can predict where to query or where to prefetch the data. Now, it sounds simple, but it's actually quite hard, because in this structure, and this is a simplified structure, but which one of these many structures is the guiding path? Which one is the path the user or the scientist is following? So we need to identify the guiding path, and this is not a trivial problem. So what we do in Scout is we use what we call iterative candidate pruning. So we use the insight that the guiding path goes through all the queries, must be in all the queries. So if we have a set of paths, we basically take, in the first query, we say all the paths within the query are potentially the path the user is following. So this is the candidate set, right? And with every subsequent query, we can reduce this candidate set. So if we take it's the first query, that gives the first candidate set. And when we take the second query, and we know that all the path, the candidate path, that the guiding path that the user is following must be in both queries. So that already reduces the candidate set quite considerably. And with every subsequent query, we can further reduce the candidate set until finally we can reliably identify the guiding path. And then once we have the guiding path, we basically take its exit location from the query, extrapolate, and then we predict a new query with it. And that's where we prefetch. And that kind of gives us this ability to account for all these twists and bends of the structure within big queries, within large queries. And of course also, the longer the sequence, the better we can predict. Because the longer the sequence, the more likely it is that we find the one guiding path that the user, the scientist, is actually following, and then the better we can predict, really. So we have measured and compared Scout, the prediction accuracy in particular, with the same experiment that we've shown before for the motivation of the other approaches. What we have done is we have taken 100k neurons, 100,000 neurons, which results in 450 million 3D cylinders. That's 27 gigabytes on disk. And again, here we have measured the cache hit rate, which is really how much of the results can we reuse, how many of the cylinders that we prefetched can we reuse. And so if you look at, we have done this for 2 different sequences with 2 different query sizes. And if we look at the first result here, we can clearly see that Scout outperforms the other approaches quite considerably. For even a very, very big or comparatively large query volume, we still get a 70% cache hit rate, whereas the others have struggled to get up to 10-15%. So that means we can reuse much more of the prefetched query result. And that's for a sequence length of only 32 queries, right? And then also for smaller queries there, I mean, the result is as expected for the related approaches. The queries are smaller, 4 times smaller, and that also means that the related approaches, the smaller the query, the better their prediction. But also for Scout, the better the prediction gets better, it's up to 90% compared to the others. Now, this is great. A high cache hit rate is fantastic, but the question is, how much of this is actually usable or visible for the user? And so what we can see is that with the current state-of-the-art, the best approach, basically the speed up is a factor of 2, and for Scout the speed up is a factor of 14.7. So for a user executing the sequence, it's going to be roughly 15 times faster, which is a quite good results. So Scout speeds up the sequences by up to 14.7x. All right, so with this, I'm going to move to the simulation, the challenges, or the approaches that we developed for the simulation, the dynamic 3D exploration. The problem there that we look at is essentially that we want to monitor how, during a simulation, the mesh that is being simulated and being deformed, how this changes throughout the simulation. So essentially, we want to look at how the mesh model, the tetrahedrals, how they change during the simulation. And that's important to understand whether or not the simulation is going correctly, is proceeding correctly, or if we need to stop, interrupt, and change things. So what we essentially need to do is, in a simulation, we have a mesh model that's being changed throughout every time step, and in every time step we need to execute range queries. So if you look at this on a time axis, we have a simulation time step and followed by a monitoring time step. Now the simulation time step, what's important here is that we have massive updates. Pretty much every object, every tetrahedra changes its position, and then we have a monitoring phase where you only have very, very few queries. These queries are typically there to extract certain parts of the model, of the mesh, in order to visualize it or in order to check other parameters, right? And then subsequently, after the monitoring step, comes the next simulation time step, and after that, the next monitoring time step, and so on, and simulation proceeds along the time axis. And of course, now for this operation, it is vital that we can execute the queries in the monitoring phase as fast as possible. Because if we don't, it slows down the simulation. So what we want to really do is keep this monitoring phase, which is largely driven by the execution of the queries. We want to keep this as short as possible. So we need efficient spatial queries on this type of dynamic data set. Now, this is not something fundamentally new. Also here we have approaches that have been developed in the past. We have, in particular, we have indexes that have been developed for moving objects. That's, for example, TPR3 or stripes. The problem with these approaches is that they have been, for example, developed for cars driving in a road network. And in that instance, you have you can easily predict the trajectory of a car, but it's much harder to predict the trajectory of one of these tetrahedrons. So the mesh movement is very much unpredictable, and so these approaches are no longer efficient. Now there's other approaches. There's, of course, as always, as we've seen already before, there's the R tree, but then there's also variants like the LUR tree or the Q-trade tree, which are essentially index structures that have been optimized for a large number of updates, which is what we have here. But what they haven't been optimized for is pretty much the entire data set changing, which is also what happens here. So they're not very efficient. What turns out actually to be very efficient is the linear scan. The linear scan is essentially the idea of not using any type of index. So we basically scan over the entire data set and then compute exactly what is within a particular range or the particular ranges if we need to. That proves to be the most efficient approach, interesting enough. But the problem with this is that the mesh models that scientists develop and simulate, they move quite quickly from coarse-grained to very fine-grained. And if you use a linear scan, we touch the entire data set. And the more fine-grained the model becomes, the slower the linear scan gets. So none of these approaches really scale with size or detail. What we have done is we have developed OCTOPUS, which is essentially where we essentially use the idea to use the mesh connectivity to retrieve the query result. So in the first time step, we basically find one random vertex in the mesh, one random point, one random tetrahedra, and then we recursively use the edges of the mesh to find the result, the remaining elements within the range query, right? And it's very efficient. You know, we can do this in time step 1, and then we find for another query, we just find any random point within the range query, and then we can do this for all the time steps very efficiently. And the important bit here is that it's completely oblivious to the location of the tetrahedron where the vertices move is completely not important to this approach. We just follow, or we just use the connectivity, the edges of the mesh. One of the problems, however, is that we may encounter non-convex meshes. These are essentially meshes which have a hole in them, like this one here, right? If we take one of the random vertices on the left-hand side of this range query, and then use the connectivity of the mesh to find the remaining results, we'll never get to the right-hand part of it, right? There's no connection between these two parts, which is a bit unfortunate, right? So what we have done with OCTOPUS, what we have decided to do is that we keep track of the surface elements, of all surface elements, and then when we want to execute the range query, what we do is we perform a surface scan and find all elements within, all surface elements within the range query. So we'll find essentially these elements on the right-hand side, and then from each one of them we use the edges to find all other elements within the range query. And this works because we'll have a surface element in both parts of this split query result here, right? So using the mesh surface essentially guarantees accuracy. Now, of course, that means we have to keep track of the surface. We are lucky in a sense that the surface doesn't change too much, and so this shouldn't affect the performance of the approach, or shouldn't affect it too much. And for example, if we have mesh deformation, as long as the surface doesn't change, there's absolutely no cost to OCTOPUS, right? We can simply scan the surface and then find the points of the surface in the query and find the remaining elements using the edges. So it scales with massive updates just as long as the surface doesn't change. Now, that's one of the weak points of OCTOPUS, but it actually turns out that the surface doesn't change too much, and what we need to do is simply to rescan the surface, the whole mesh, once in a while to find the surface points. But that's a fairly cheap operation, as we'll see when we get to the experimental results. So it scales with massive updates. What's also quite important is that with this trend that I mentioned before, that scientists increasingly simulate more detailed meshes, OCTOPUS scales quite well with that as well, because all we need to do is keep track of the surface points, and they will increase quadratically, whereas the whole number of points will increase cubically. So we only depend on the quadratic increase of the surface points. So essentially, in terms of scalability, the surface grows slower than the volume, and that also, of course, also helps OCTOPUS compared with the linear scan. So it scales well with mesh resolution. Now let us have a look at the performance evaluation. So we used here a dataset, a tetrahedral mesh, which is 33 gigabytes in main memory, and we did 15 queries. We executed 15 queries per time step, and we executed 60 time steps in total. We measure on the x-axis of this experiment, we measure the mesh detail, the increasing number of size of the data set, but also with that the mesh detail, and we measure on the y-axis the total time to execute the queries. We only compare OCTOPUS against linear scan because it turns out this is by far the most efficient approach of the state of the art. All the other approaches, like I said, some of them struggle with the unpredictable movement of the mesh, the others struggle with the sheer magnitude of the change in the data set. They're just not designed for it. So the linear scan is the fastest, and as you can see, OCTOPUS is quite a bit faster than linear scan. It completely outperforms it. And to make this a bit more visible, here we show on the y-axis the speed up as opposed to just the total time. And also there we see that the more detailed it becomes, the data set becomes, the more speed up OCTOPUS actually delivers. So we have an improvement of 8 to 14 times by using OCTOPUS. Now I just want to follow up or conclude with briefly mentioning what we have done here. Again, using this relatively simplified workflow used in the simulation sciences. So what we have done is we have developed several approaches. I didn't cover all of the work, but we have done for model validation, we have developed FLAT and Scout, and for simulation we have developed OCTOPUS. Now in terms of impact, what we have done, so the work that we have done here that we've shown helps scientists that are working in the Human Brain Project to analyze data sets. Some of these tools have become part of the tool sets used every day. FLAT, for example, has become a part of the model building process of building ever bigger brain models. And what we have been able to do, amongst other measures, is to increase the size of the models that are being built in the Human Brain Project. So with that, I would like to conclude with the work that I've just presented, with these tools that are usable, that can be used within the project. We have basically enabled data exploration, which is key to scientific discovery. And we have shown that using this spatial connectivity, with that we can achieve scalability. We've done this for FLAT and also for OCTOPUS and Scout, where this connectivity is available implicitly in the data set. So with that, I would like to conclude, and would like to also to say that all these tools are available for use to analyze data sets within the project. Okay, let me talk about data management more specifically in the Human Brain Project. The goal of the Human Brain Project is to build a platform to simulate human brain activity in order to better understand the human brain, to develop new treatments, early diagnosis, and also to get better idea on how we can develop hardware that can simulate brain activity better. The Human Brain Project is a massive undertaking that will take about 10 years and will cost 1 billion euros and will involve the coordination of more than 200 interdisciplinary partners. On a very high level, the vision of the Human Brain Project is threefold. We have one aspect which is future medicine. The idea there is to move from a purely symptom-based diagnosis of malfunction of the brain to a biology-based classification such that the diagnosis becomes more objective. And that helps to find or to diagnose malfunction of the brain much earlier, which then again leads to better treatment with a better outcome for patients. Another aspect is future neuroscience. The idea here is to integrate all available data about the brain that is now scattered in different resources, to integrate this together so that we can find the causal chain of events from genes to cognition. And then finally also, third aspect is the one of future computing, which means that we need to establish supercomputing as a scientific method, but also means that we have to build the supercomputers that are actually able to simulate human brain activity. The ones we have today are simply not powerful enough. So it's going to take a massive effort to understand how to build these new computing infrastructure and also the models to program them. And then another aspect of future computing is to find novel ways to simulate brain activity more efficient on hardware. Because with the current supercomputers, we know that already they are not efficient. They consume way too much energy when simulating brain activity. Now I'm going to talk about two particular aspects of the Human Brain Project where a lot of data is involved. One, for example, is the high performance computing aspect. The goal there is to simulate the entire brain. That involves a lot of data, right? We have to, in order to simulate the brain, we first need to build a model. That takes into account literature. That also needs neuroscience data that is readily available already today. And it also involves lab data that needs to first be taken out of the lab, taken out of in vivo samples, and so on. With all this, we build a massive model of the brain and then simulate it on a supercomputer, which leads on the one hand to time series data that we can see. You can see an example at the bottom right, and also to visualizations of the simulation output, right? And this is a lot of data. It's a lot of data because the simulation infrastructure is massive. Currently, what is being used, or has been used until recently, is a Blue Gene P with about 16,000 cores. And these are 16,000 cores and 16 terabyte of main memory that produce massive amounts of data. The simulation result is very, very big. We have a massive number of time series that record the voltage at different parts in the brain and even different parts of the neuron in the brain. And as what you can see on the right-hand side is a visualization of this at one instance of time. And to produce such a visualization, one has to take into account terabytes of data of time series that exactly precisely measure the voltage at different points. So these are really massive amounts of data, and I'll talk briefly about later how we're going to analyze these amounts of data. Another aspect of the project is medical informatics. I mentioned this before in the sense with the future medicine, right? The idea here is to integrate clinical information at hospitals. So what we want to do is to take all the information we have about patients and integrate them such that we can find clusters of patients with similar traits. For example, what we do is we take patient record history information, right, all available information about the patient. We take MRIs, we take protein markers, we take genetic information. We integrate this all together, and then we try to find clusters of similar patients such that we can objectively define what exactly constitutes brain disease. So also here, massive amounts of data need to be integrated. And the challenge between these two aspects is somewhat different, right? With the high performance computing, with the supercomputing, we have a lot of data which is reasonably well structured, but it all looks the same. It all has the same structure. Whereas in medical informatics, we have a different challenge, which is we don't have that much data, still a lot of data, but not that much. But it's all different type of data with a lot of error, with a lot of wrong information in it. So it's an integration effort, really. So to talk a bit about the data management within the HPP. So for example, we have different aspects where we need data management tools in the HPP. We have the literature analysis, which feeds into the model building that I've been mentioning for the building of the brain model, right? There, what we can use is Hadoop, right? The neuroscience data collections, then, this is typically information that is fairly well structured. And when we have structure, then we can also use a relational database. That probably makes the most sense. Also for lab data, we don't have too much data. It's not a lot of data because it's a very laborious process to get this data out, and it's also very well structured data. So also here, MySQL, Postgres, or in general relational databases are probably best used. And then we have streaming time series analytics, right? There's time series that are being streamed out of the supercomputing infrastructure. There, the system that can be used are Spark and Storm, which have particularly been designed for streaming time series. We also have static time series that are probably also best served with Spark and Storm. And then finally we have spatial data, for which even to this day no really good solution exists other than the tools that have been developed within the project. But none of the commercially available or freely available NoSQL or SQL systems support spatial data very well. Now with that, I would like to conclude. So data management has undergone tremendous changes. It has changed considerably in the sense that we have new requirements and new applications, new use cases, and that has changed the design completely. The needs of scientific applications are still not served very well. I think we made a lot of progress. A lot of the systems, particularly in the NoSQL space, are easy to use and give the performance that we need. They are more adaptive to the new data models that we have, but still there are open problems like the one I mentioned before, spatial data, which isn't served very well today, as well as large-scale analysis.